all, and welcome back to the channel. My name's JB, and today we have another episode of Xenoblade Explained. On tonight's episode, we're going to be looking into how and why Shulk became a god. But a quick disclaimer before this video starts, this video will contain slightly more speculation compared to the other Xenoblade Explains, due to the answer of how Shulk became a god primarily coming from each person's perspective. There will of course be spoilers throughout this video for the entirety of Xenoblade Chronicles DE, so you have also been warned. But with all that out of the way, let's jump right into the video. And so the first thing I want to start off discussing in this video is when Shulk turned into a god. And this question isn't necessarily as simple as it seems. Was it the first time he met Alvis in Tephra Cave? Was it after when he was killed and shot by Dixon and revived later on? Or was it just when he obtained the third Monado? I believe these all to be incorrect, and Shulk became a god 14 years before the events of the main story on the Monado expedition. Zanza, who is virtually the Monado, killed everybody who went on that expedition, including Shulk. However, he had already chosen Shulk to be his new vessel, and therefore used his power as a god to revive him. And I believe that's the moment that Shulk truly became a god. This was all of course part of Zanza's plan, to turn Shulk into his vessel, where he intended to dwell for the next millennia. But I believe there's slightly more to this. Zanza needed to transfer his abilities to Shulk, so that once he'd taken over his body, he still had access to all of his previous abilities as a god. Thinking of it from a computing standpoint, which makes a bit of sense considering that's kind of what the world is, Zanza had transferred his admin privileges over to Shulk, and Zanza doing this is what caused Shulk to be able to become a god. And hey, I could be wrong about all of this, but something similar to this must have happened. Alvis states at the end that Zanza was the one to turn Shulk into a god.
The old god was defeated by the new god that he himself created.
New god?
Yes. That is why I appeared before you, Shulk.
The reason I also think this is likely is because Zanza didn't try to make anyone else's vessel after failing with Shulk. This could have been due to the fact that he managed to obtain Maynard's Monado, or it could be the case that he couldn't transfer his body, say, into Dunban's because his admin privileges wasn't there, meaning he wouldn't have access to all of his godlike powers. And Shulk never discovered these powers before because he was just trying to live his life as a Hom, because that's all he believed he was. It's not until much later that Shulk then came into contact with the tool that would begin to give him access to his godlike powers, the Monado, which leads us nicely onto the point of how Shulk could use Zanza's Monado in the first place. And it's kind of already been explained. Zanza gave Shulk access to his powers so he could utilise the Monado, which I've already stated is virtually Zanza himself. Zanza's main plan was also never to dwell outside of Shulk, as he already mentioned in the story that he intended to dwell in Shulk for the next millennia, presumably the same way that he had dwelled within Alvis for all that time. So Shulk could use the Monado hunky-dory just because Zanza let him, basically. But again, there's a little bit more to it. We see Alvis being possessed by Zanza in a cutscene, and although we don't get to speak to him for very long, as far as I can tell, Alvis' soul and personality is completely gone and has been completely replaced by Zanza. However, this never occurs to Shulk, and this is even stated by Ego, with the fact that Shulk is able to maintain a sense of self, which is what prevented Zanza from taking over and overall controlling Shulk's body. And I believe this is why Shulk eventually suffers the same pain that Dunban always experienced when he was wielding the Monado. Through sheer willpower, both Shulk and Dunban were able to resist Zanza's control, and this meant that ultimately Zanza would not be able to take over Shulk and him be his vessel, and therefore would not be able to seek out his own goals, if it wasn't for the interference of Dixon. And by taking out and shooting Shulk, it allowed allowed Zanza's soul to escape from the tomb he had built himself, which was Shulk's body, and allowed him to once again roam free. Shulk, however, now being a god himself, and without the restrictions of Zanza within him, allowed him to recover quickly and to take the fight to Zanza, which leads us on to how Shulk was able to slay a god. Assuming that everything we've talked about in this video up to this point is correct, then it's safe to assume that Shulk's godlike powers would be the same as Zanza's, which isn't necessarily to see the future, but to manipulate fate itself, which is why Shulk wasn't seeing visions at that point in the story, but was more knowing what was about to happen, because the power wasn't being gifted to him from Zanza, but he was using the power he had himself, because it had been utilised and used over and over again through Zanza. Basically, Zanza showing Shulk visions through the entire game allowed Shulk to know how to use and control his ability, albeit subconsciously. Anyways, once Shulk and the gang had reached Zanza at the final stage of the game, they of course brawl until Shulk draws out his third Monado, or as I understand it, his true Monado. It seems reasonable to say that if Zanza's true power was in his Monado, then Shulk's own power and Mayneth's would also be within their Monados. If you remember, the way to utilise a Monado is thinking of your enemy and having the power to take them down, which was taught via Alvis in Magna Forest, and Shulk shows that power once again when fighting Metalface at Prison Island on the first visit. And the same thing can be assumed when facing Zanza, as the symbol for God appears in the Ring of Light, and Shulk is able to slay a god. Fun fact as well, if you didn't already know, the symbols that appear in the Monado actually have certain references. The symbol when facing Zanza stands for God, the symbol that appears when facing Metalface on Prison Island is person, and so on and so forth for each of the Monado's abilities. Anyways, getting back on topic, Shulk defeats Zanza, and from that moment, being the only god left in the world, takes control over the world of Bionis and Mechonis, and reforms the world and relinquishes his power as a god to create a world with no need for gods. And that virtually sums up how Shulk became a god. But you may still be wondering one thing, and that's why Alvis kept on appearing to Shulk during his development. Did he have any influence on Shulk becoming a god? Well, in my opinion, yes and no. Alvis did seem to influence some of Shulk's decisions and push Shulk in the direction of becoming another god, but I don't think he ever directly empowered Shulk and provided him with any godlike abilities. He was more or less just a guide for Shulk, which helped him go down the correct path where his fate would not be decided by Zanza and he could make the decision for himself, as Alvis clearly seems to have no bias between the both of them, as he once served and helped Zanza as his disciple. It seems that Shulk's passage of fate was just a little bit stronger overall. And that sums up this episode of Xenoblade Explained. Once again, I'd just like to remind you that this episode features a little bit more interpretation than the other episodes of Xenoblade Explained, as there is no clear answer to how Shulk actually became a god, as unfortunately in real life there's no example to take from. But that said, I hope you've all enjoyed. Make sure to leave comments in the comment section down below on future topics for me to feature on the Xenoblade Explained series. And once again, apologies for the lack of videos recently. I'm trying to get back into the hang of uploading on a regular basis. But until next time guys, peace.